All right, welcome. Welcome to Design for Drupal, 10-year anniversary, and welcome to my session, Building a Living Style Guide with Herman. And I'm going to dissect that a little bit and talk about the sort of components of that title. My name's Chris Wells. I am from Redfin Solutions. We're a smallish dev shop based out of Portland, Maine. So there's 6 people with us now. We're growing into different roles. That means we're growing into different and bigger projects, and we're bringing newer and newer processes into our projects as we do them. You know, just sort of growing up. So I'm kind of a full stack guy. Redfin started with 2 of us that were partners, and so, you know, by nature, I kind of had to know a little bit of everything in the business. So I'm still kind of that full stack guy, and we're working towards growing and hiring into different roles and putting people in those roles. So with that said, that means kind of jack of all trades, master of none. So I'm not a front end specialist, but I do love playing with new tools. So pretty much I take recommendations from Twitter and then I play with them. And this is one of those experiments that I really loved. So we've been doing Drupal exclusively since about 2005. Our first site was in Drupal 4.7. We've never looked back. So we've been in the Drupal game for a long time. I have a huge online identity crisis. So at CO on Twitter, cwells on Drupal.org or in the Drupal Slack. I don't really do the IRC thing anymore, but if I do, cwells there. GitHub, I'm probably going to publish these slides to a GitHub later, so Chris from Redfin on GitHub. Probably the best way if you just want to reach me is on Twitter, and I'll point you to wherever you need to be next. So. All right, so we are going to talk about building a living style guide with Herman. So first we need to talk about a style guide and sort of establish what that is and what that means. So we're talking, there's been a lot of talk in recent years about this concept of atomic design and building components, and especially as developers who want to be dry and don't repeat yourselves, then we want to build a reusable library of components and patterns. But you need a way to communicate these components and patterns back and forth between your designers and your developers. So that's what the style guide serves to do. In this realm of web development, obviously style guides have existed in print design and relative to branding for a very long time, but we're talking about technically these kinds of style guides for web projects. And so it also helps to establish standards about what's already there. So I've talked about our sort of growing pains in our process. And when we had one developer, I knew what was there because I wrote all of it. But as we grow, that's not the case. And we would run into situations where 2 people were inventing the same mixin at the same time to do the same thing. And this especially happens at the beginning of a project. So, okay, well, we haven't made a full bleed yet, you know, or copied that from a canonical library, or maybe we copied it from a previous project, but maybe the new guy didn't know that we had that in a previous project, and he found something from Smashing Magazine and did that, and now you have 2 mix-ins. So we can communicate what we've done and what's already there. A really great example of this is eyedropping the PDF to get your colors, right? And so you end up with 19 very similar shades of blue. So it really keeps designers and developers in sync. And in fact, the motto of this, Badam-ching, is to keep designers and developers on the same page. And the reason for that is it's actually a web page. So it's also living, okay? As we develop this, especially if we're going agile, which a lot of projects are moving towards that way, iterate. Okay, what's new? What's the new thing? Okay, now we're in sprint 2, but look, we've got some of this reusable work. So we need to be able to develop this on an ongoing basis, even as we're building our website. So I'll talk about this in just a minute with sort of why Herman and why Herman came about. But as we have new needs, we have new components. And even thinking about maintenance projects. So, you know, we'll do, especially at Redfin, we stick with our clients like, you know, till the bitter end. So we build a project, but then it might be, 6 months later they come back and they want a new feature. They want to do a photo gallery from their events. They want to be able to attach this. Well, I need to go back and remember, what should I be using for my previous and next arrows? I don't want to go combing the site. I can just look it up and say, oh, look, we got icons for that. We have that. So it's useful that it's alive. It's always living. And then Herman. So how did Herman come about? Herman has followed this trajectory of sort of small shop, bigger shop, and it was invented by the folks at Oddbird, which Miriam Suzanne is related to, and I believe she's a principal of. And we have been following at Redfin Miriam's work for a long time, because a few years back when semantic CSS grid frameworks were a thing, we were deciding between Zen and Singularity and Suzy, and we went with Suzy. Those they were all really great frameworks, but I just really liked the syntax of Suzy the best, and I was the one who got to make those decisions back then. So that's what we went with. And so I love all of Miriam's work, so I saw her tweet about this new style guide thing, and I decided to check it out. And the reason is that I think Oddbird is about the same size as Redfin, so they're growing into these projects, and they're needing something. But that doesn't mean that they're building $500,000 websites. They're not doing Salesforce Lightning's, the new Lightning UI for Salesforce. If anyone's seen that, that is an entire team dedicated to just building out the style guide, the pattern library, the components. But not everyone has a dedicated team that works on the UI experience. But we still need to reap some of those benefits. And that is where I think Herman fits in nicely, is that you can do that enterprisey kind of level of having a style guide and having it documented without needing a budget or a separate team or a separate real line item in your project. You can do this as you go. And it's a good way to dip your toes into doing this if you've never done it before, because the friction is really low. It's a low barrier to entry to get yourself a style guide if you're not using one now. And this is Miriam's concept, that if it's not documented, it doesn't exist, right? That's what we found when we started creating 2 full bleed mixins that, behaved similarly, did the same thing, did them slightly different. We had 2 of them because it wasn't documented. So it didn't exist. So we assumed it didn't exist and created another one. So that's what we're trying to do here with Herman, is take that next level up in your growth process. And the whole point of this is we have to reduce friction. We have to make it easy for developers and designers to communicate and for developers to create this as we go. So Herman is really just a Sass doc theme. So to understand Herman, you do need to understand a little bit about Sass doc and what that is. Has anyone heard of Sass doc? Couple of people. All right, good. So has anyone heard of Doxygen or PHP doc? Okay. So Sass doc is to Sass what JS doc or PHP doc is to JavaScript or PHP. It's a documentation system to build pretty documentation. And I might not say in the blink of an eye, but this is a quote from Herman's page. And fundamentally, this is what you need to know. SassDoc parses your source folder and grabs documentation-specific comments. So all it does is read your Sass comments and generate a style guide for you. And the style guide, this is another static site builder. It's just a tool that builds a small static website that contains your style guide. But it does it by parsing the comments. So if you're that first developer in there, you're in your Agile sprint, and you say, I'm going to make this full bleed mixin, you make it, you comment it as you go. You're probably already commenting it lightly. Add another 2 minutes and document it a little bit more thoroughly, and we have a tool that can strip that out and create a static site for you with all of your components. And that's what this thing's going to do. There are other tools that do this. So Pattern Lab's the first one that comes to mind. I think that Herman and Pattern Lab serve slightly different needs, with Pattern Lab living on that other side of enterprisey, and Herman living on this side of the more smaller project, dip your toes. So I don't think it has to be that way. I think they both do very similar things and can do very similar things, but where they came from and how they grew up was a little bit different. So, to use SassDoc, we're going to take a look at some SassDoc annotations. So SassDoc comments begin with 3 slashes. And if you're starting this project, you're probably in a modern stack like Yarn or NPM. You're using node packages for other things in your build process and your front-end stack. So what you would do is add SassDoc to your sort of front-end stack. Okay? So you can see on the first line here, a general description. There's no, this is a SassDoc block. It starts with 3 slashes. This here is what we call an annotation. And if you have seen any of Drupal core's PHP source code, it looks incredibly similar to all the blocks that sit above PHP functions in Drupal 8. And that's one of the things that I really liked about this, is that it already plugged into the way I thought about doing Drupal documentation, that is very similar. You can also use / blocks at the top of your file. That's called a poster. And it starts with 4 slashes and a blank and ends with 4 slashes on a blank. And then in between you can do 3 or more slashes. So I just kept it all at 4. And when you use a poster, you can document everything in the file the same way. So let's say you have a partial that just contains all of your mixins. You can just say, hey, every block in here, every mixin that you find is going to go on the same page in the style guide, the mixins page. You'll see that as I build up this style guide as we go. So you can then override it. If you have one mixin that's you want to just put somewhere else, you can override group. But this allows you to sort of set defaults for your whole file at once. So here we have a poster, and here we have a regular block. You can see we're using the author annotation, the name annotation, param annotations. And so let me show you a little bit of this. So this is sort of version 1, starting out. You do yarn add SassDoc. If you're going to use Herman, you're going to use SassDoc theme Herman. It's going to use Node Sass to do some internal compilation. So you need Node Sass, unless you're not going to use rendered examples, but that's pretty much the coolest part of this, so you're going to need Node Sass. And then, for whatever reason, we just like bypassed the grunts and gulps at Redfin, and so we were stuck for a long time in Bundler and using Ruby Gems and Compass and Sass. And then when we decided to jump, we jumped right up to Dart Sass, which is the I'm not in the right thing. It just F5'd me when I use a laser pointer. All right, I can't point at this. So we jumped over to Dart Sass, the replacement for Ruby Sass. So I've got that in there as well, just so that I can actually compile my Sass, because that's what I'm doing to do that. So that's just it. That's the whole shell. That's everything you need. So I'm going to pop over here, and I'm going to check out version 2 here. So now we're going to set up some actual Sass. So I did this very simply to start. I've got my regular style CSS, and then I'm importing 2 partials from the same folder. This is not highly organized, but it is simple. And right now, there's nothing in them. Anything else of value here? I also threw a readme.markdown in there because I hate warnings. So Herman, or I'm not sure if it's a SassDoc thing or a Herman thing, but it's going to look for a readme.markdown file and make that sort of, take that content and put it on the home page of your style guide. So I threw one in here. That's it. Just so that it would not give me the warning about readme.markdown being missing. And then I'll show you this. So the .sassdocrc is a great way. I also hate typing command line parameters over and over. So you can specify certain config in the sassdocrc. So we'll talk a little bit now about what each of those are. So the sassdocrc looks like that. So all the config options are available to you. there. All the different annotations that are available were on a previous slide. So we saw param, we saw group, a few others. So you'll do a sass.rc file. So you can say if there's something you need to exclude, where are you going to output the static site? So it can be in your project, not in your project, wherever you want to put that. And groups we'll talk about a little bit more. So I've shown this. We're going to add sass.theme, Herman, and node Sass. And then there is additional configuration that goes in the sass.rc that goes in the Herman key, and we'll see that as we build this up a little bit. So I think I talked about dest, exclude, and theme. So if you use sass.doc without Herman, it comes with a default theme, which is like more of a just kind of pink, red, yellow scheme. So Herman, in addition to being a theme for sass.doc with a specific aesthetic, it also provides all this additional functionality. It's really cool. All right, so Sass setup, add some partials, add some yarn scripts. That's the other thing that I should show. So I set up these partials. Right now they're blank. I also set up a NPM script to, nuts, I did it again. Don't press F5. Called guide. So I would type yarn guide or yarn run guide, and that's just issuing that command line command, sass.doc, and then point it at your Sass. That's the command that says go into the Sass, parse all the commented documentation, and generate the static site. Where does it put it? Wherever you specified in your sass.doc.rc. So we add some partials, added some yarn scripts. So we've got kind of a whole lot of nothing right now. If I were to run yarn guide now, I'm going to generate out my very first style guide. And there it is. All it is that README markdown file's contents dropped into this pretty little static site. I kill my inspector, I suppose. Well, you know what? I might show you something in a little bit, so I'll leave it up for now. So that's it. That's the whole style guide. But now we want to go in and start extending this style guide and show the things that we want to show. So we can document a mix-in. We'll see a few annotations here: group, author, param, output, and we'll see a free-floating comment, and we'll see an example. So if I can come back over here real quick, check out V3, and I'll just go ahead and recompile that guide. Still nothing in components, but here in setup, this is where I will put all of my styles that don't actually, or all my Sass that don't actually generate any styles. So my utility functions, mixins, extends, placeholders, those kinds of things. So remember, sass.doc only cares about 3/ comments. So 2/ comments like that are irrelevant. sass.doc won't look at them, won't parse them, won't care. So that's a comment that's in here to explain what we're looking at for the purposes of this demo. But where the magic really happens is when you see the 3/ comments. So the first thing you see is a free-floating block. It's not attached to anything. That is to say, when the the 3/ stop, there's a blank line. So that's just going to become sort of a paragraph of text that lives inside your style guide. So I think I rebuilt this, right? So now we see a new group called mixins right here. So this free-floating comment belongs in the mixins group. So groups just become your left-hand navigation. And then mixins, custom reusable but configurable tools we use. Right there, custom reusable but configurable tools we use. So that's that free-floating comment. The rest of this all applies to this mixin. So this is a responsive iframe mixin that we use all over the place. We stole it from Smashing Magazine. It's never not been relevant since years ago when we first got it. So looking at this block, you see some floating text, you see the group, you see the author, you see parameters that have been specified to the mixin. You can actually specify defaults in that param annotation as well. and what does it output, and here's some example SCSS, responsive embed, and here's how to use it if you want to use this embed container. And that's what we're looking at here. What's the mixin? Who wrote it? What parameters does it take? What does it output? And there's the example that I specified, the responsive embed with the include embed container, just to show you how you could use it. All this stuff's optional, so whatever makes sense for you and for your team as far as documentation, it's up to you how much you're going to write in that doc file. So what I want to do is take this up a level. So if we are back here, this last annotation we haven't seen yet, at example. Actually we have, but it has been an example SCSS. We can also do, if I rebuild this, we can do example HTML. So when we specify the language, don't point. After the add example annotation, we'll see how this is going to render. So if we go back here and look at our style guide again, now we're going to see compiled CSS. So how does this actually compile? So you can find bugs in things that you've written right here in your style guide while you're documenting it. But also you'll get a fully rendered example. So you will get, it's a great album, by the way, if you want to take notes. Dave Dill, Chorus of Dawn. Highly recommend it if you like sort of old rock and roll. So, but it's a new album. So you'll get the HTML rendered and, shown to you in the HTML section. You'll see the tags, but then you'll actually see the rendered example. So one gotcha to point out is like, well, this is my responsive iframe, right? So this is wrapped in an iframe wrapper, and it's all responsive, and you'll see soon that it is not. That's because the way that it renders your examples is itself in an iframe that is not responsive. So you may need to tweak. You can actually get at the CSS and the styles that are around your actual style guide, but I didn't. So that's just one little gotcha to know, is that when it's going to render your example, it's going to render it in an iframe. And this is really interesting because it's not using the source attribute. It's using the source doc attribute and actually putting the contents of the iframe right there in that attribute, which is wild. But cool, right? Because now we can see our components. We can see the things that we're building. So we're starting to get that concept of a component library down. So that's what we did. We added another example, but we used HTML as the type, and we can see a fully rendered example. So now let's document and extend. So this is a similar concept, but if we want to see a real live rendered example, we're going to need some additional CSS in there. So what we can do is go back to our sass.rc file, and we can specify custom CSS as a key in that sort of ini file. It's kind of YAML syntax for what it's worth. So that means we're at a point where we have to write real Sass as well. We can't just write, like so far we've just written in the style guide. And this is one thing that really tripped me up initially, was trying to think of like, well, I can just do all this standalone using Herman and using SassDoc. But that's not how it's intended to live. It's intended to live alongside the real Sass and the real CSS that you're using. So there's two things to consider: the compilation that's happening of your style guide and the compilation that actually needs to happen of your real Sass into CSS, which you then need to take and inject into your style guide's iframes so that it uses those styles. And so really, you need a modern build process to really make this work seamlessly. And that's one thing that actually tripped me up, was I was trying to strip this down to its bare essentials and was having a hard time because I wasn't compiling my regular CSS and my style guide and then taking the compiled CSS to inject back in so that I could see that. So I'll show you that right now. I think I may have added some, so I built a bunch more NPM scripts, as you can see here, or yarn scripts, to build the actual CSS, and to build the guide, and then build all, which will do both things, and then I can watch it, and then I can use Browser Sync to watch it, because as I was building the demo, I needed those kinds of tools as well. So now, if I do a yarn build all, that's going to compile my Sass, and it's going to compile and build and generate my style guide. So when we pop over here, now we're going to see an extend. So these are, this is like a placeholder style extend. So percent button. The thing about this is, if you're going to extend percent button, I'm not giving you any colors. So I need to communicate that to other developers, for example. So that's where I mentioned in the documentation, line 48, note, you should be setting your own color and background. You need to do that if you're going to use this extend. Note that the underscores around it, all of your SassDoc annotations are parsed as Markdown. So that will actually be italicized when we look at the style guide. It's kind of neat. So I have an example SCSS and an example HTML. But now to actually use this, I now need to have, starting on line 8, an actual thing that I can render in my example. So I need to render fake submit. That extends button, but also sets the background color, border color, all those things that the documentation told me I needed to do. Did I build? Yeah, I did build this, right? So now I have a new group called extends, which was back here. So I put it in a different group. So now I have all my extends that I can document here. Now we have an actual rendered example of a styled component on my site. And boy, I wish I got rid of that underline, but you can't win them all. So now we're starting to document smaller components that are used on the site. So you can layer these things to build your button primary, your button secondary actions, whatever it is that you're working on. But that's the real gotcha. You gotta have your CSS is actually going to get compiled and then injected into the rendered example. The other thing to know, SassDoc supports groups, but Herman enhances SassDoc's use of groups to allow one level of nesting and also add ordering. SassDoc will just spit them out in the order it finds them, but Herman will let you specify the order that you want to see them in. So we can add a top-level utility, and then we can match slugs to friendly names. So as you've seen so far, my group extends lowercase, my group mixins lowercase. We can build on that once I go over to where am I? 6. And rebuild. You can see it'll match the slugs up. So I now have a utility section and I have friendly names. Now this is really the suite of tools that goes beyond just what SassDoc does. Documenting your tools to actually documenting your brand identity, documenting your initial patterns, things that are set in your style guide but not able to be necessarily demonstrated anywhere else. So Herman's design tokens let you specify your colors and build color palettes into your style guide. It lets you specify typography previews so you can see the fully rendered fonts and how the characters look, the fallback stacks, all that sort of stuff. It lets you specify ratios. So again, this is where my jack of all tradesness falls down. I'm not entirely sure why this is useful, but for designy people in here, they probably do. So here's a thing you can do. You can specify your ratios so that you can see how rapidly they're growing or shrinking as you maybe change your sizes. So you can change you can specify text sizes in your typography stack, so you can see what does 2rem look like and what is the baseline rem, for example, and see it rendered next to each other, and you can document your icon sets if you're using SVGs. If you're using an icon font, you can put that in the typography section and use that annotation. But if you're using a folder of SVG icons, this is basically the easiest one to use. You just specify the path to your SVG icons. So I think, all right, I'm not going to touch on this yet. So let's walk through some of these things. So what else did I do in V6? I got to see what else. Was I showing you anything besides those groups? I don't think so. Okay, so let's move on to V7. So I think all those slides that I just walked through, we'll go through those sort of one at a time. And I should build this, I guess, too. You can see how my process updated itself throughout my building of this so that it now says done when it's done. All right, I put it at the beginning. So this is where the really good Herman-y stuff starts to kick in. You can specify all of your brand colors, and then the pattern that you follow is you put your things in a map, a Sass map, and then you need to, but line 16, you Herman add that map to a particular key in what is ultimately exported as JSON so the style guide can read it. This is the weirdest thing about Herman. They 100% acknowledge that it's the weirdest thing about Herman, and they are working on it for sure. But the thing that you need to know if you're really going to, I sort of battled this and tried to understand it. On line 1, I'm going to get the Herman utilities. I'm going to bring them right in from node modules, and that's going to give me this Herman add mixin, which I use on line 16. So the first key to that Herman add is one of those 5 things, well, 4 things that I ran through: colors, typography, ratios, sizes. Then you say what the key is from line 5. So in the annotation, you're saying this is the brand colors, and then you pass the variable. So the variable can be something different, but I didn't do it on this one. I probably did it. I did it somewhere else just to show. So here I'm adding also to colors, but a set of neutrals, and that map is in the neutrals map. But that could very well just be called grays, and I could call it neutrals and grays. So it's just got a... The first thing is what you're putting into Herman. The second thing is matching your annotation. And the third thing is the map that you're doing. And then with Herman add, there's some more configuration that needs to live inside of Sass.rc. So we already talked about custom CSS. That's your actual compiled CSS that goes with your rendered examples. Then you have include paths and includes. So include paths is when it's going to resolve an @import statement. Where can I look? So you can look in the Sass folder. Sass setup. Remember, that's that partial that I used for all of my utility stuff that itself doesn't actually generate any CSS output, just mixins, placeholders, that sort of thing. Because that doesn't generate any output itself, I can automatically import and compile that into my style guide so that I can, let's say when I'm writing an example annotation, if I want to use one of my mixins, I can use it. It'll always be available to my compiled examples because it's auto-included. The JSON file is what Herman add is doing. So that Herman add is taking that Sass map and exporting JSON into Sass. So if I show you my compiled CSS, you can see here in this comment, these are all my colors that the front-end style guide is using to render my color palette. Orange, blue, green, they match up. So you can specify, hey, where is this JSON that Herman needs so that it can render this out. I just put it in my style.css because that's where I called Herman add. Herman add is what spits it out. So I went ahead and did it in my style CSS because it really renders as a CSS comment anyway. But you could spit it out into a separate file somewhere else if you wanted to. All right. All right, doing okay. So now when we compile that out, we see actual brand colors. So again, me as a developer, all right, well, I need to use one of the brand colors for these arrows for this slideshow. What's going to look best? It's either going to be the green or the olive. Let me go see. What are those colors again? All right, here it is, right here. And so I'm not eye-dropping anything again. I know what the brand green is, and it's communicated right here in something that's already in your build process. After colors, we'll go to, we're going to look at a very similar pattern. All right. Typography stacks. So here I've added a couple of different stacks. So here we can add relevant documentation like, hey, the budget's really tight, we're trying to use Google fonts, so here are the Google fonts we're going to use because they're free. This goes in the group type, this free-floating comment. So any comments just about typography in general, but now here's my specific sans stack that I'm using, which is Lato. Lato? Does anyone know? I say Lato with a long A. We just decided. All right, and Merriweather for our other font. You can suck them right in from Google Fonts. So you just, you're pointing to what your link href would be. So you do need to put the link that you need or the script tag, whatever is going to be used, goes under this font annotation. And then you say, hey, which stacks do I want to see in my preview? So here in my type, I'm going to use the sans font. It's going to be, I need this in order for it to render, and then I want to see that in normal, bold, and italic. In the serif, I only want to see normal and bold. I'm using that on headings, and I don't ever want a heading to be in italic, for example. So the same pattern. Ooh, sorry. You specify a map, you Herman add, which section, which annotation, and what variable. So here is where I've done something different. I had serif font as my annotation, but my variable is actually heading font. Just a little different, just so you know it's possible. So now we have a typography stack. So I built out my typography, and I can see my previews in Lato, normal, bold, and italic, and my heading fonts in Merriweather in normal and bold. Taking slightly more time as we go to build this. Ratios and sizes. So here I've added ratios, which display out in that sort of ruler format for you, and text sizes. So I had actually a few more than the screenshot would show. So I have what my H1 might be, my H2. Again, these can be anything you want. So readable text is going to be at 1.125. So that's what I might want to make for something else. In my root, it's going to be 16. So that's going to be generally what I see. And as we reload and look at that, now we can see my ratios and my sizing. All my text sizes. You can actually show your size previews as a ruler as well, if you'd rather see that more like a ratio, like how much bigger is the H1 than the H2, for example. If you want it to be twice the size, the ruler is more helpful for that. I like seeing the actual rendered text size preview. And then easy one at the end. The icons annotation is the one I should have started with. It's just what group do you want it in, so I added that. And then icons and the name of the folder that has your icons. So it will just go and scan through for any SVGs that are in that folder and just write them all out with its file name and give you a real preview of the SVG so that you know what iconography is available. Again, this is about the language of communicating back and forth between designers and developers, and also for developers to know, hey, what's already there? What icons do I have available? Do I need a new one? Do I need to go to a designer to figure out what that new icon should be? Or do we have something I can use? All right. So that brings us into some of the real power that we can get into here. And this is the part that is more mind-blowing for me. I certainly fell flat on my face worrying about this. So Nunchucks. Nunchucks is a templating engine for JavaScript. It is heavily inspired by Jinja 2. But do you know what else is heavily inspired by Jinja 2? Twig is. Django and Jinja templates. So if you have been doing any Twig templating in Drupal 8, this will look very similar. This is where the line, I think, starts to get a little blurry with using Herman versus going up a step to something like Pattern Lab. Right now, Pattern Lab has some really cool Drupal modules, some really good support for when you write a template, and it can actually merge those into the Twig templates that Drupal will pick up on. With Pattern Lab, you are writing your templates in Twig. So it ports over very easily, whereas in Herman, you're writing them in Nunchucks, which is slightly different, but it looks very familiar. So when you're getting into the realm of like, boy, I really think I'm writing this markup twice because I'm building out this vast component library with Herman, right now in the Drupal space, that's where I might recommend maybe it's time to look at something like Pattern Lab. But if you're not, and you're still in that dip your toe space, I think Herman is a really good tool for that. So if I just get my last version here, there's kind of a lot to look at. But I just want to touch on it because it was very overwhelming for me, and I don't want it to be very overwhelming for you. But over here in the Sass.rc, we've added a Nunchucks key that is specific to Herman and told it where our templates should live. So I made a simple card and cards template. And this looks a lot like Twig. I wrote them in macros. So you can see that a card is wrapped in a div class card. It has an image, a caption, and an attribution. And that cards, plural, imports the card macro and then gets passed an array of cards. And then for each one, render it in the card template. So you can nest your templates and output them. Using this inside of components now, I've had to document my card component to say that it belongs in a molecules group and that my example uses Nunchucks now. Not HTML, not SCSS, but using Nunchucks, I'm going to import card macro as bill and then draw a bill card. Here in organisms now, I'm doing like a card set or a cards or something, right? So here's my example NJK. I'm importing the cards plural macro, which then will go on to import the card singular, and then I'm passing it an array of 3 items to fill in those cards. And then, of course, what that actually does for my components. So this, again, is where it gets really cool, because now you can see a molecule organism. So here's my card SCSS. Here's my Nunchucks template. Here's the actual compiled HTML. And here is the actual rendered example of my card. Again, jack of all trades, not a designer. Some grays, some italics, some font sizes. There we are. Okay. Then if I look at my organisms component group, I can see my Nunchucks, my compiled HTML, and my 3 of cards. Man, there's a lot of Steven Seagal with swords in this library. If you have not used these, like you use Place Kitten and then Phil Murray, the placecage.com and stevensongallery.com is fantastic. All three of them. So this is where you really start to build up on, okay, I want to show these people the components that already exist on my site. You know, the call me, the contact widget, the button set, the, you know, save, cancel, go back set of actions. All those little components can be documented and built up in this living style guide, but the advantage is that you get to go and do it on the fly. If you want to dip your toes in this, you document as you go, and you make it part of your build process. So an actual real-world build of this. Websites, scholars, themes, scholars, package JSON. This is where I have good old Sasquatch here is our task that will actually run an initial build, use polling to watch for Sass, and then we'll call yarn run build, which is itself a meta task that will lint it, compile it, post-process it, and then run the style guide task, which will actually build the style guide out all at once. So it's just watching, I'm changing my Sass, and it's building this stuff on the fly as it goes. So I can always go back and go look at the style guide. With that said, of course, it's only as good as what you put into it. So as part of this exercise, I went back, having not thought about it, but documenting as we went, and went back and looked at the style guide that was like our pioneer for this, and I was like, ooh, this needs some work. This would benefit from some additional documentation. We have 2 paragraph components documented. I think there's like 18 paragraph types on the site. So it's up to you to use this, but this is a really great tool, again, if you want to dip your toes and enter this space. And again, Chaz does a really wonderful training and a lot of really great work with Pattern Lab and knows a lot more about that area. So if this is something that you're interested in, I would definitely recommend picking his brain on that stuff. Lunch is in 12 minutes. Theoretically, I should be done in 2, but we're only backing up to lunch, so I'll take any questions now or whatever you'd like to do. Other than that, here.
So sometimes the annotation came at the end of the Herman comment. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it came at the beginning. I was just wondering what the distinction is there.
It generally doesn't matter. I would say pick a convention. However, in the free floating, the right thing to do is put the description first and the annotation second. It didn't work when I did it the other way. So as a general rule, I have tried to do general descriptions, whether free floating or not, at the beginning, and then do all my annotations at the end. Generally, that's how PHP doc looks and JS doc looks, so I would say that's kind of the convention, so that's the way you should do it. Other questions? All right. Well, I'm around. Oh, yeah.
I missed the beginning, so you may have addressed this. Could you compare this to KSS?
Yeah, so we played briefly with KSS, and I really love the promise that KSS brought. I would say it's a comparable tool to KSS. Again, my reason for picking like Suzy over Singularity was like the difference in syntax, and I find this syntax is just a little bit more flexible than KSS's was. I didn't play with KSS a ton, but both of these are 2 tools that generally do the same thing. What I think Herman does add is the color stacks, the typography stacks, and some of those sort of built-ins that just kind of help you with your branding and communicating that aspect of it. Another tool that I looked at just to sort of know what's out there is called Living CSS. Another tool which really does the same thing, but it uses like Polymer on the back end, which I know that guy from UPenn, Brian Olendijk, is doing a ton of really great work with Polymer and hacks and stuff with Drupal, but it's not anything I know anything about, so I kind of stayed away from Living CSS. I understood all the technologies that were at play here. So it was, again, frictionless, easy for me to step up and step into.
For like just random styles, say like the views row or something, would you be doing this sort of documentation for that? Or is it mainly just for like reusable classes?
So it's really nice when you do it, when you think of it as a component. The lines do start to get blurry. The question is, how reusable is it? So do you need to document the views row that's styled this way just in this one view? Probably not, because it's pretty unique and specific. On the other hand, would a developer coming along 6 months down the road like to know that they're doing something that looks exactly like that? You know, you have to sort of play those games, but I would be more inclined to say no, that the documentation effort isn't going to be worth it at that point. What it's really good for, though, is like your view modes. Like, we do a lot more work with views and view modes, and so I will try and do like a general teaser. But one thing that I do sometimes is, rather than having to write a full Nunchucks template or even just example markup, I will take a screenshot, and Markdown is parsed, so I'll just take a screenshot of the paragraph and be like, oh, this is what this paragraph looks like. It's still documentation. It's still an okay way to do it. It's not gonna. It's less living in that capacity, but if you're getting towards the tail end of a project and you want to do it that way, that's okay too. What else was I going to say about that? I don't remember. Here.
Are there any new things, like the typography thing is great, and the colors? Are there any that they demanded, or are they working on it?
I don't know what is being worked on at this point. I think they're mostly working on making it a little bit easier to use and unwonking some of this weird Herman export JSON stuff. I think that I'll say this, they were incredibly responsive in the issue queues when I was like, I'm having trouble setting this up. I didn't understand, and I was stumbling over fundamentals of like, oh yeah, I have to build my CSS and build my style guide and things like that. They're incredibly helpful. So if there's something that you're like, wow, I really wish I could see this way, I think they'd be very open to seeing people use it and probably very much welcome pull requests. If not, work on it themselves. I don't want to throw them under the bus. So I don't know what else is planned in that realm, but I tend to say it's a pretty new tool. So I would say 6 months ago was that initial tweet of like, here's this new 1.0 of this tool that we've been using when they open sourced it. So in contrast with something like, especially in the Drupal world, Pattern Lab, it's really more tried and true, and there's a little bit more of a base around it. But I use this tool, and I thought it was really useful, and that's kind of why I come to conferences and say, well, here's something in case you want it.
Well, I think the add group stuff, you can just make up your own group names.
Absolutely, yeah. The group here in the annotation should be like slug formatted, which I think is like think Drupal machine name. So underscore separated lowercase, can't have spaces, and then you can just map the slug to whatever you want, but it's all completely arbitrary. Yeah. So you can use this to do atomic design, like I started doing organisms and molecules in a separate section, but you might want to document per organism, and so you have an organism section, and then you have a page for each one. It's totally up to you. It's very flexible, which is great, but it means you also need to sort of architect your documentation system as well. Okay. Thanks so much for your time. I appreciate you coming. And 5 minutes till lunch, and if you see me around anywhere and want to pick my brain on it, I'm more than happy to stop and chat.